as some people might have heard in the chat, we haven't really been in the earlier sessions of the conference because we're in the US, and so this is quite early for me. It's 9 a.m. So we're coming at this with a little bit less context of what you've already been speaking about. But we hope that this ultimately is useful to you in some way. Like Sarah mentioned, we both have academic backgrounds, but we primarily conduct research within the technology industry right now. And we were interested in applying to this conference. We saw that there was an emphasis kind of like on in-person and small scale events. So we're coming at it from a slightly different angle in that we did research mainly on large scale events, but how people create small scale experiences within larger virtual events. So that's what we'll be speaking about, and then maybe discussing, how this perspective might help us rethink virtual live events. Let's see. So yeah, the goal of the research, it was conducted over the course of 7 months, and the purpose was really to understand, from within the tech industry, how might the PC better support people's emerging practices, particularly as they use technology for virtual events and gatherings and to experience things that they're a fan of. So we studied how fans engage in both formal and informal gatherings. By formal, I mean like produced events, and by informal, I mean just sort of bottom-up processes of fans gathering together online and connecting with each other. And we were trying to understand, how do the technical and social factors work together so that people can pursue an enjoyable experience?
For this qualitative study, we pre-selected 3 live events because we wanted to be able to participate ourselves, anthropologically speaking, and also to be able to have conversations with our research participants about specific events rather than asking them about their general opinions about virtual events generally. We focused on 3 types of fan communities that are very rich and pluralistic. So we looked at geek culture, we looked at music, and we looked at sports. And we want to also just have a quick side note to say that when you're conceptualizing the way in which people are interacting with these events, it's not just one person signing up on their computer and then it just is screening, but rather people were gathering online first, like communities of friends, and then attending it together, or they were getting together in person and experiencing the event together. So for example, in one case, people flew to a particular home of a friend and they sort of staged their own little music festival in the living room with lots of different types of digital things together and experienced Slender together. So I want you to think about this more expansively beyond just like one person signing on to an event. We were going for a very in-depth anthropological study. So we recruited 14 fans across these 3 types of fan communities. And what we were going for was more granular data. So it wasn't a survey-like study. We did a lot of diary exercises, in-depth interviews. We did ethnographic observation in virtual spaces with them and informal spaces, and also attending the formal events and also following up with them after they had attended these virtual events. And, so it's very typical qualitative research, as, for the social scientists in the room. We, after we recorded the interviews, we wrote up field notes, engaged in several levels of analysis, identifying patterns and coming up with our insights.
As I mentioned earlier, we were looking at fans in both informal settings before, during, and after the formal events, as well as during the formal events themselves. So we took kind of like a multi-platform, multi-device perspective. We wanted to see how people interacted with events and members of the community across different parts of the experience. And we found that in particularly in the informal gathering settings, that people that we started to realize just how important these spaces had become with the pandemic. So this is Cody. He's 23 years old. He's a fan of anime and he's a gamer. And he talks about using Discord as his main social outlet. So he says, basically, to me, it's the same as face-to-face communication. It keeps me connected with all my friends. I'm on Discord every single day, especially in adulthood. There's not many people who say they talk to their friends every day. So it was a mundane experience that helped people connect to their friends and just have a social life, but then it also linked up to these larger, more extraordinary experiences where artists and the things that they were a fan of came to present. And in addition to the field research, we also had conducted 13 expert interviews. We were kind of trying to understand the broader trend of virtual events and which might stick in the long term versus which might return to in-person post-COVID. So we talked to a range of experts. For example, people who were organizing professional conferences that were now happening virtually. We spoke to people in the arts, so people who were transitioning museum content to virtual format so that people could do museum tours online. We spoke to people who were transmitting religious services virtually. So you get the idea. It was kind of a broad range of different types of events, but people who had expertise in hosting the event. And then also we spoke to people who worked at the technology platforms themselves, which were the tools that these event organizers were leveraging to reach people at scale.
So one of the main findings for our analysis is that within these virtual gatherings, fans are engaged in 3 specific behaviors that they're doing at the same time, simultaneously. And their ability to do these 3 things simultaneously is also how they evaluate the quality of their experience of these virtual events, right? So we call them the 3 C's: consumption, connection, and commentary. So consumption is basically the ability to consume content, right? This is the material that people use as conversation starters, or it's a shared experience that it becomes very meaningful, like just as an in-person experience does. Connection is really about the ability to enjoy a virtual experience in real time together with other people and engage in a very casual atmosphere of being together in time and space, right? And commentary is a really important part of not only consuming, but also being able to comment literally on the experience, on the content in a very playful and imaginative way, right? So these things are happening throughout the event at the same time, and they're happening on multiple platforms and apps, right? So in person, where people are gathered physically, so it's a very multi-sensorial, multimedia ways in which people are interacting with the content that is very particular to a virtual event that we could talk more about later.
Within the large-scale virtual events, we found that the fans were really able to take control and also utilize new features that were made available to them in order to experience small-scale intimacy. So that even when there was a large virtual event happening at that scale, at glance, it might seem impersonal in theory, but based on what people actually did, their practices, and also what technology now enables and affords, is this small scale intimacy for a larger number of people. And we found that the small scale intimacy was really a key feature of what we're referring to as the new hybrid event, which had been facilitated by the pandemic. So we realized that hybrid events were always in existence in some form. So take the example of Coachella. Pre-COVID, there was an in-person concert in 2018, 99,000 people attended in person, but then there was also a virtual component where 43.2 million people streamed the concert from their home. Fast forward to 2020 and 2021, most of these live events were just completely canceled. And then slowly things started to become only virtual. So with these lockdown restrictions, people only started doing things in the home, broadcasting to people's homes. But what we see now after a couple of years is this new definition of hybrid, in which small scale intimacy is able to happen at key junctures of the experience. And this mainly happens directly before and directly after the virtual event, so that audiences feel more connected to the community as well as to the artist. So we have, for example, a concert in which, prior to the virtual concert, there might be an at-home kit where fans can engage with the physical kit to make them feel more connected. Or they might have a behind-the-scenes access, which they paid $5 extra to attend. During the concert itself, there's just more interactive control of the experience. So Splendor, for example, which was the virtual music festival that we attended, attendees could actually control the camera angle at which they saw the artist themselves. So instead of kind of being stuck in a sea of other fans, and maybe there's a tall person in front of you and you can't even see the artist that you came to see, there is this more interactive control and personalization of experience that comes with technological affordances.
We observed this small scale intimacy being achieved in at least 3 ways. So the first one is thinking about the before and after. The behind the scenes experience allowed fans to see an unscripted side of the talent, right? And being able to pose questions and comment directly in a way that they got to see a different side of the talent. And as Rebekah was mentioning, the multi-camera viewing is really important because people are put into a more active role because they are essentially becoming their own TV programmer, right? They're controlling the experience by choosing the perspective that they want. So it's a more interactive, more active position. We also observed a lot more fan to fan and fan to artist informal interactions, right? So a lot of fans are bonding with each other and elongating sort of the magic that sort of surrounds the quote main event, right? So they're reliving and celebrating before and after, and we see a lot more of these types of interactions happening that enables them to achieve this intimacy.
And one of the concepts that we found useful throughout the work was relational labor by Nancy Baim. She introduces the concept. She has, a book called Playing to the Crowd, where she talks about how contemporary musicians and artists have to sort of perform this new type of labor that was amplified with the introduction of new technologies that influence the music industry. And she defines this as the ongoing interactive, effective, material and cognitive work of communicating with people over time to create structures that can support continued work. This kind of relational work is done as part of a job, which she uses to distinguish it from just emotional labor in general. It's part of a job, paid or otherwise, or in hopes of securing one. And so a key part of her argument is that the artist and the rock star of the past before this technological change was more physically and emotionally removed from their audience, that they kind of were almost like gods that sit above them and eventually, at some key points came down to interact with fans. But with more relational labor necessitated by the internet, artists and musicians found themselves in need of doing more things in order just to get their work done. They needed to connect with fans on social media. They needed to respond to them. And so, one of the things that we found, with the shift to completely virtual events was that some of this was still true, but we also found that just the fans themselves were actually willing to take on more of this labor, especially if it created that sense of community amongst themselves in virtual spaces, that the fans were sort of hungry for that community and were willing and able to put in that work. And so experiencing a virtual event actually became an act of mutual labor exchange in which not only the artist was doing the work, but the fans were sustaining the fan communities. And one example is Lana, who is a college student in Toronto, and she considers herself a super fan of Taylor Parks, otherwise known as a stan. And she actually prefers her online friends over what she calls the locals or people that she would just meet in her neighborhood or school. So her best friends are actually fellow fans of Taylor's, and she calls them her new support team. And she says, I'm grateful for the artists I love. I made so many close friends that care about me and I care about them. It's rewarding to be stans. I have a new family. It's an online family. And she actually has 2 separate chats that she maintains through iMessage with other fans. So one is with 5 people, and then another one is an even smaller community. And one of the things that was interesting that she mentioned was that she feels like it's up to them to keep the conversation going. That even, Taylor, if she posts new content online, that might help. Again, that sort of content, thinking back to those 3 pillars, content, commentary, and connection. The consuming the content and having new content helps create the community, but she ultimately thinks it's their responsibility and their burden to keep the community and the conversation going.
For small scale intimacy, it's not just about facilitating friendships within the fan communities, but it's also about democratizing this feeling of exclusivity between fans and event organizers, right? So we're going to talk about this in relation to both artists that we've been talking about, but also what we're calling micro celebrities or local celebrities. So the first example I have is, one of the biggest Jewish congregations in the United States created a completely different experience for their congregants. And the senior rabbi who gives this big speech on the most important Jewish holiday enabled this behind the scenes interaction virtually for all the Gen Zers of his congregation. And so this was really important because, for a lot of people who are part of this congregation, and it's a national really figure in a way, because they've had their services online before COVID. To get the rabbi's time and have a meaningful connection is an important part of building community. It was so interesting about this behind the scenes intimate sort of relationship that he developed with the Gen Zers of his congregation was that for the Gen Zers, they felt it was the first time that they could have an authentic experience with the rabbi, because the setup was in a way that they wanted to socially interact, because they could observe and be part of the conversation. And what was important was that they could at any point in time be invited in to speak, but there wasn't a pressure for them to always sort of have that direct sort of conversation, keep it going with the rabbi. So the particulars of how they wanted to socially interact was really important, and that sort of connection with the rabbi created a sense of focused attention that was intimate, that wasn't achieved before. And it was very particular to this type of experience. Another example comes from the Kentucky Derby, where for the first time it went hybrid, it went virtual. And, as maybe many of you know, that a big part of the conversation of Kentucky Derby is, what hats, what fascinators do people have, and being able to comment on that. And what made this particular event more democratic is that, Tom Brady, an American footballer who attended, was at a particular place in the stand, and with this particular virtual experience in which there was cameras everywhere and you could choose where you wanted to sit, more people got to sit right next to Tom Brady. And what we saw going on in the online community during this virtual event was that everyone was able to comment directly on Tom Brady's hat as if they were sitting next to him. And so this was playing out in real time and virtual, and it was inviting more people to be part of this sort of exclusive seat. And so this is what we're talking about in terms of democratizing a sense of exclusivity, that this made it more possible for people to be a part of this moment.
So just to conclude, our research has shown that these virtual live events present new opportunities for meaningful engagement at a small scale between artists and fans. And so we're not just talking about having a breakout room or participating in a group chat, but really the social experience of fandom being reconfigured when attending and experiencing live virtual events. and also just this mutual exchange of labor that both the artists and fans are participating in. And, we found that when fans have this opportunity to do more of the relational work, they absolutely take it. It creates more emotional investment in the experience, and it helps them just feel more connected to the experience and to the artists and other people. And so, we think as artists, leverage these virtual formats, they might actually benefit from looking to their fans themselves to help co-create the sense of community that many people have felt has been lacking since the pandemic. So that's what we have prepared. Happy to discuss or answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting presentation and really interesting research that throws up a lot of questions. Sorry, it shouldn't sound that way, but yeah, lots of questions. Before I start with mine, is there anyone out there who wants to ask a question?
Oops. I saw that I meant to click on chat rather than share screen. I think Wanda had a question that we should answer, right?
Yes.
Does commentary include critical analysis? Yeah, I think most people weren't critical of what they're a fan of, but were critical of the event. So a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the commentary, at the beginning of an event is often people struggling with technical issues. But even that created a sense of community. Like people liked seeing that. They're like, oh, other people are having trouble setting up the event too. So it became a point of, connection, ultimately, complaining about technology. It would end up being a little bit more critical, I think, when there was nobody who was responsible at the event for helping them. Then it sort of, I think, spiraled into a more critical commentary. Though, I'm not sure if that's what you mean by critical analysis. But I didn't find any people who were like critiquing, the artists themselves. They were there for the artists, but they were more critical of tech and how that might get in the way of experiencing the artist.
I think another important thing to draw attention to is that, and sort of beyond the scope of this sort of paper, but there's this broader context about thinking about Gen Z and the habits that they're forming and how that's being spread across different generations. So I wouldn't, say it's specific to Gen Z, but I do think there's something really important about the fact that there is, so a lot of scholars are talking about how the ways in which Gen Z uses and communicates online, that sort of changes our definition for a lot of concepts, whether it's like literacy, critical thinking, and all of that, because I think the large sort of ways that people are signing on and engaging with each other on the outside perspective, without a lot of familiarity, it seems very superficial. But actually, a lot of scholars are saying that the lack of hierarchy is precisely the value that people are bringing online. And that sort of lack of hierarchy is a positive value. And so the chatting of like, oh, I'm having problems, and other people within the community helping them, that is an expression of a particular democratic value. So it's related to how people are engaging and building community that I think is the sort of the larger picture. But please do tell us more about what your thoughts were about critical analysis, because I think that for the fan communities, it's.
I also want to add that the other Rebekah brings up a good point in that our sample skewed younger, so that's important to note. I think that most of the people we did research on were in their late teens, like 18 or 19, 20s, possibly early 30s. So I think that's an important thing that she's bringing up, the generational approach as well.
So Wanda, go ahead.
Just to answer your question, I didn't mean critical as negative criticism. I meant just, do they talk about what they're watching or
yes,
listening
they
to
do
in all kinds of other ways rather than
Yes. There's a lot of sub communities, like on Discord. They will comment on a particular anime film, what the director was doing, or especially with anime, I was talking about the history of Japanese culture being transmitted to Western cultures. So there's a lot of conversations that are happening in smaller sort of communities, or even off the main platform, or in these informal interactions with either the writers or the talent. So there is a lot of previous knowledge that people are bringing to the table because we're looking at fan communities. And so there are conversations and a lot of knowledge that is coming in. We noticed that for the older respondents that we had, when they were like listening to music, they were like, oh, what happened to the Killers? And they were like on their phone, like Wikipediaing, and then like commenting like, oh, I didn't know that he was Mormon. Like there was like a lot of like commentary about that and like what that means for, but I wouldn't say that when I hear critical analysis, you know, as academics in their room, I don't think people are going to these particular communities for that particular sort of feeling. I think it's more social.
Yes. Steve.
I think Steve has his hand up.
Yeah, Steve has a non-golden hand up.
Okay, apparently. Thank you so much, Rebekah, for that presentation. I was really interested to hear about sort of your sense of maybe the role of fans in being intermediaries or moderators. I think that's kind of maybe what you were suggesting, but maybe correct me if I've misunderstood that. I guess I'm interested in how your sense of how those dynamics are playing out, particularly when, what's the question? I'm conscious of friends who gone from having careers in comedy, working in live spaces, to doing it online and having to completely reinvent the boundaries they have with their fan communities, because there is a sense of intimacy that their fan base thinks that they have because they're accessing this person in their home through Discord. And there's been a few instances where people really have just had to kind of like quite firmly put their foot down with their fan base and go, you don't own the entirety of me. So I'm conscious of like the complexity of that negotiation that goes with this new sense of maybe involvement and intimacy. So I was just wondering if any elements of that had come up in your research, because it seems so wonderful and powerful, but also something where the implicit rules that might apply in a comedy club or a theatre or a gig, they don't translate obviously to an online space. Does that question make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, that makes a lot of. Do you want to comment more about Nancy Bain? Because I think that's the reason why we brought up Nancy Bain.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is like the classic what Nancy Bain meant when she talked about relational labor. But what we're trying to say is that fans are also going horizontally to each other, and so I think for you know, we heard people say, oh, I started a meme. So like Lana like started this meme and like a viral video that sort of caught on, and she was expecting that the artist would either share or respond, you know, because she kind of created momentum around the artist. She's doing some of the work, but the artist never responded. The artist never acknowledged her as the sort of generator of the viral experience. But she was kind of just like, you know, that's okay, you know, and it could have just been like how our participants were, but she was like, she felt like she still got something out of the experience because she connected to the broader community through creating that viral video. So I think there's a horizontal sort of branching out that I think artists can leverage because they might not want to do all that relational labor going forward.
But I think you raised an important point that we did discuss, which is, I mean, the capitalistic part of this entire thing, right? So, you know, for a lot of musicians specifically, you know, we didn't study comedians, but, you know, people aren't making money on their music. They're making money off of like these other things. So artists themselves are seeking to make themselves available in many other avenues, because they gain from it, right? And fans want more. And so there is this, it is a little bit of a dance. I think what I was particularly concerned about with the sheer amount of cameras, like thinking about the Kentucky Derby. So now basically what is different today with the hybrid is that there are more interviews with the jockeys. So there's more ways in which people are accessing sports stars, like in the pit, like basically there are more moments that were quite honestly private for the artist, right? But the thing was, it was also very exclusive. So those who went behind stage before and after the show was like a very small amount of people who were allowed in, right? It was that exclusivity. So what is strange about this whole thing is that it's simultaneously putting up the value of democratization, but it's also putting a lot of ask on the talent. But what we're seeing is that fans themselves are taking out labor. So it's not one-sided labor. But the thing is, I think it's like, it's a whole sort of like mess behind it. What are the motivations behind it? So it is true that there's more labor on the artist, but the artist is also gaining financially from all of these interactions.
And
so it's a little bit.
Yeah, they're able to do small scale at a larger scale. Like they don't have to physically shake every individual's hand. Let's say after a concert, if there was like a meet and greet, they don't actually have to meet every single person. It's still kind of a broadcast model, but the audience feels like it's personal.
Right. So the rabbi who did this behind the scenes, he said this was great because usually he would have to do one-on-one meetings with different congregants and to sort of deliver that. And it's really stressful, especially as he's preparing for like the big holiday sort of speech, right? And so for him, his ability, like when the board says like, you really need to call up the big donors, like it is unsustainable for the rabbi who was being asked to do a lot of work during the pandemic, right? Because a lot of people were breaking, there was very heartbreaking funeral. So he's doing a lot of work clergy-wise, but what this did was enabled him to give a one-on-one intimate experience to all of the young people in his congregation. This is a massive congregation, right? With national sort of following and like, so the ability to democratize and to make possible this particular kind of intimacy is very, I don't know if it's new, but it is something that we are trying to draw attention to. We see this as something that didn't exist before.
Yeah, thank you. Your presentation and this discussion is really challenging some of my bias, and it's kind of what you're saying. I feel it's a bit scary, to be honest, as well. But it's also because I mean, you made that point about we really need to consider that we've got these late teen generation or age gap who apparently seem to have a very different concept of intimacy to maybe my generation or older generations. And of course, we are observing this again and again, the younger, with the other generations, because it is this staged intimacy that, of course, it's not intimacy, but it's mostly exclusive access to exclusive access to something. I can't really say that.
Maybe that is intimacy, though.
Yeah, that's the question. So this is why I feel, why I really like this discussion, because it is challenging my bias about intimacy. Because who says that kind of the intimacy of in-person small-scale meetings isn't as imagined, or as as imagined or imaginative as that of these virtual platforms. So really interesting. But still, one other thing with, maybe this is also something Nancy Baim is elaborating on, because she seems to draw on this attention economy that artist needs to deal with. It's so interesting that the artist, for me, it's just scary that these fans and their labor is so the only person who benefits from that financially the fans are working and paying to do that work. And that's interesting for me. So that just...
Well, yes, but I also think there are many fans who make money themselves on Instagram, on TikTok.
yeah.
So like in NFTs. I mean, I think what's really important here, I mean, as a Gen Xer myself, I think I entered in this research. I mean, I get the I get paper newspapers. I'm a very analog person. I have actual books, you know, like, so I'm a former academic, right? So like, I think what's really important here is to really sort of rethink, as an anthropologist, what we think is normal, what we think is social, what we think is intimate. And I think that all of my projects are on Gen Z. And it's not that I mean, I am also like with Louis Manon and critiquing generational studies. I understand the critiques of how like intellectually sloppy that can be. However, I do think there is something we need to understand about Gen Z way of being that is distinct and that is not worse. I think we say a lot of things that are, we say about technology has been said.
Who's we, Rebekah? When you say we?
I feel like the subtext here, like people's concerns, people attending to critical analysis, the whole thrust of this program is about, you know, live events. And maybe, you know, obviously we weren't part of earlier discussions, so I'm conjecturing here, but I do think there's something really important to talk about, not fearing or having a different frame when talking about technology and the different ways that we think about it. Because, you know, we have at GEMIC, we have a lot of our people that work here are PhDs. I have one Greek scholar who was a professor at Vanderbilt who said, you know, for early, you know, Greek works, people said people were becoming stupider with the technology of writing because you no longer had to remember things. So I just want to remember the fact that like all sorts of technology over time were seen as a loss of humanity, a loss of social. And so here, I think the big learning here, what our research doesn't tell you that we presented earlier for a different audience was how early on in the pandemic, we tried replicating things from the live virtually, and it was a total failure. My favorite example is the clap feature. They created this clap feature because they're like, oh, we're missing this from like concerts. It was horrible because it sounded terrible. It was distracting. Nobody liked it. But I think what it taught us is that the value of virtual events is things that could not exist in real life. That's the value. It's a different kind of being in the world. I also think, you know, I'm doing a whole study on truth among Gen Z. Truth is like not even like that's not even a value. Okay. Like, so when we talk about values, I think it's really important when we're engaging in any conversation that we really sort of position ourselves of whose value of what it makes for a really good experience. What does live mean to you versus somebody else, right? My use of the word democratizing, the reason why I'm talking about this, I think I can't sort of convey the sheer number of people. We're talking about lots of thousands of people. We're not talking about like, you know, like 10 people who are engaging in this, these moments and these events. That's why I'm using the word democratizing, because there is a broader context of how the community is setting the tone. The community through their actions, through their commentary, through their connection, are deciding what are the tenets, what are the social norms, who's in and who's out. Like that's not being unilaterally decided by the artist or the entertainment agency or even like the famous TikTokers. There is a police, I'm using this as a Gen Xer, there is a moderating that happens democratically that is really important to understand about these fan communities and how they're interacting with artists. So maybe that's not the best word, but I don't think it's just about inclusivity. It's not just about
it's not just more people,
in.
but it's more sort of you know, uniform opportunity for engagement and for control across more people. That's why I sort of brought the term, you know, horizontal as opposed to, you know, vertical or top down.
It's very active.
It's a bit like fan fiction. You know, when you
right.
When, you know, in I don't know, Star Trek, you just write collaboratively another episode of Star Trek that was never really
filmed. And those are rooted in online communities as well.
Yes,
so
this is what example. I meant. Yes, this is why I. So, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I feel like we went over time a bit. Any
But
last
Nick, I think
thoughts, or?
Nick, do you have a question, Nick?
Well, I have tons of, it was so interesting. I was thinking about when you said that Coachella had how many attendees virtually? And this was before the pandemic?
Millions, yeah, I think
Millions.
something like 43 million.
Well, I think of how many more things I have gone to virtually. And I thought, I once went to a stand-up comedy show on Animal Crossing, like a couple of years ago, that Margaret Cho hosted. And it was so well done. It couldn't have happened, and I couldn't have seen Margaret Cho live from Ann Arbor, but I could see her on Animal Crossing. So I think one thing I'm aware of is how much more access, since I live in the Midwest, I can't go to these things, and how many more readings and how many more events I've gone to through these things, and also how people use the chat differently. I think that when I first went to something in person recently, I was sort of looking for the chat feature, like a place where there could be some either back channel or less hierarchical communication. And I'm really like attentive to all the things that I hope we never unlearn when we go back into the presumption that everything is in person. And I think the things that you highlighted suggest that that's not as much of a danger as I thought. I think that there's so many communities that have been built in virtual platforms that they'll continue.
I think that was a bit the common sense of today's anyways, wasn't it? You know,
That's
Okay,
true. I think we saw a lot more global audiences.
Yeah. Oh, Rebekah, thank you so much for your really well informed presentation and this really lively discussions that you normally don't have at the end of a conference day. So, and thank you everyone who stayed so long and so late for today.